Thank you for joining us. This is the Center for Audit Quality's Profession in Focus, focusing today on audit committee considerations in the COVID-19 environment. I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum, Senior Director of Professional Practice at the CAQ. I'm pleased to be joined with Corporate Director Brian Anderson and BDO's Amy Rojik. Our topics today will include liquidity, cybersecurity, and working in a virtual environment. To start with, Brian, could I ask you please to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Vanessa. Delighted to join you. And I'm currently a member of the CAQ governing board, as Vanessa mentioned. And I also sit on 4 public company audit committees: W.W. Granger, Pulte Group, James Hardie PLC, and Stericycle. And I currently chair the audit committees of James Hardie and Stericycle. And in past years, I've also chaired Pulte's and Granger's audit committee. I'm a retired CFO, and earlier in my career, I was also a Big Four audit partner. And it's really my pleasure to share what I've observed over the past few months as it relates to COVID and other issues. Thank you.
Great, and I'm Amy Rojik. I'm a partner in our National Practice Office for BDO, and I founded and I direct our firm's Center for Corporate Governance and Financial Reporting, and that's overseeing my firm's communication and governance efforts. So in addition to my years of experience as an auditor, my focus currently is leading our efforts to provide thought leadership and continuing education to clients and contacts related to corporate governance and financial accounting and reporting topics of interest. And I'm very glad to join Brian and Vanessa today in talking about some of the areas that have impacted both the auditors and the audit committees that we serve.
Thanks, both of you, for joining us. So we're doing this via Zoom in June 2020, about 3 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, a very serious situation, and appreciate you guys sharing your observations. So Brian, especially in this pandemic, what are some top concerns that you're finding audit committees are focused on?
Thanks. And first, just for context, I think I'm reminded of a little over a year ago, the Business Roundtable updated their view of the purpose of the corporation to take a more extensive view or expansive view of the corporation, not just serving shareholders, but serving a broader group of stakeholders, including employees, customers, suppliers, and communities at large, in addition to serving shareholder interests. And I think with this pandemic, on all my boards, while we've always had that broader focus, I think this crisis has really brought this model into much sharper focus, as obviously it really strikes across all of these various stakeholders. And when you couple that with the current challenges we're going through as a society, I think there are great opportunities for corporate leadership to really step up and show bold leadership in helping navigate the country, not just through COVID, but also the other challenges that we face as a society. And I'm proud of what I've seen by several corporations in this regard. As it relates to the pandemic, obviously, whenever there is very high uncertainty, liquidity is the best hedge to protect against those issues. And on all my boards, immediately there was a very strong focus on liquidity and cash flow management. All of them really created the equivalent of a cash flow war room in effect, with a CFO and treasurers taking the lead, but also working very closely with the CEOs and operating management to just ensure that all hands were on deck and that there was good focus on all of the various levers that could be exercised as it relates to prudent cash flow management. So in all cases, I think companies quickly reduced their variable expenses and also did extensive modeling of the outlook for the business, with various scenarios, and you know, the old saying of, if you plan for the worst, then you know, everything else will be an upside. And that was certainly a guiding principle for several of the companies that I've been associated with. Also, a really good focus on capital expenditures and other strategic investments where that could either be delayed or eliminated, quite frankly. Certainly, you know, some companies tapped existing credit lines as they looked at their balance sheet and access to capital. And in addition to that, taking a really comprehensive look at capital allocation strategies as it relates to dividends, share repurchases, et cetera, and the appropriate you know, mix between debt and equity, and you know, short and long, and the mix of short and long-term debt. I think that throughout the crisis, the focus on real-time modeling with the FP&A functions, the financial planning and analysis functions, really working incredibly hard under challenging circumstances to ensure that you know, the day-to-day outlook of the business in the face of significantly declining revenues was clearly well understood by the operators, so that they could take you know, appropriate action to quickly reduce cash outflows. Also, there's in a period like this, there's just an incredible need to communicate very clearly and frequently with your employees, suppliers, customers, et cetera, to just ensure that everyone understands the state of the business from the perspectives that are relevant to them. In addition, all of my companies, you know, pulled existing guidance, but stepped up their communication with the investor community to ensure that there was, you know, good transparency in what the business was seeing near term and the actions, you know, it was taking to, you know, protect, you know, employee health and safety, customer engagement along the similar lines, as well as just actions being taken to ensure adequate liquidity to survive, you know, the downturn resulting from the crisis.
Thanks,
So
Brian.
I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Those were all great points. Amy, can you talk about what you're seeing and maybe touch upon a little bit from a financial reporting consideration standpoint?
Sure, and I think all of the operational considerations that Brian just alluded to really show evidence of good governance practices, and that's very similar to what we're seeing in our client base. All of the operational decision making, the planning, all of that kind of speaks to the testament of how strong your governance oversight is. I think in terms of relating that directly into the financial reporting side of the house, I mean, good governance drives transparency. You know, you're looking at risk factors and how decisions are being made. For example, you know, Brian spoke about consideration of lending and the liquidity options that you have. It's your relationships with your vendors and your lenders. Some chose to maybe draw down on credit lines that were available to them, while others needed to truly consider the negotiations with lenders in terms of, you know, whether or not their debt covenants might be triggered and how that would impact your financial reporting and the ability to extend credit terms in these situations. I think there you also have the ongoing assessment of contracts. You know, we're talking about, you know, revenue that may not be there, right? So looking at your contracts, looking at your leasing arrangements, other things like that in terms of risk, the probability of collections on your accounts receivable, looking at the valuation of your intangibles on your books. I mean, there's a significant need for many of our companies that we're dealing with to engage experts in this area. So subject matter experts on valuation were needed to help in estimating for forecasting, given the current challenges that really differ by industry. So really having that deep industry knowledge. Impairments is obviously another area of significance that we look to in financial reporting with the fluidity of the situation around COVID-19. We have a continued lockdown, we have phased openings happening. So all of this, I would probably look in hindsight, but we're also looking forward to how that's going to play out over the next several quarters and what that means for companies where they're trying to guesstimate what's going to happen next, in places where the pandemic may be resurging, for example.
Thanks, Amy. Brian, let's move to the topic of cybersecurity. This is an increased risk right these days, partially or perhaps specifically because of the increased amount of employees working from home. Can you touch on this for our listeners?
Yes, I think companies have seen a really significant increase in the volume of phishing attempts and phishing attacks with the metrics that they typically look at to monitor potential intrusions to their networks. And, there's been increased threats of ransomware. So I think it's really important for companies to really harden their defenses in the cyber area and accelerate any investments that were planned for later in the year to continue to improve defenses and just ensure that all of your underlying software patches, et cetera, are up to date and current. And to the extent that you can do, for example, a tabletop exercise on what would you do if you did have a ransomware attack? How secure are your offsite backup facilities, and how quickly could you recover, without paying a ransom, and quite frankly, not being sure that you wouldn't be hit again. So clearly, the fact that employees are working from home and working in what might be viewed a very comfortable environment, it's important to keep the communication, very front of center with all employees, to remind them of all of the guidance as it relates to, clicking on suspicious emails, et cetera, and alerting them to where to go if they have any suspicions that their device may have been compromised in some manner. So clearly, the threat has increased. I think the benefit of this is that we're all now really aggressively focused on closing whatever gaps we have in our networks, and really making sure that we're protecting critical assets, critical information assets in that regard.
Thanks, Brian. I know it's hard for us to know when and if we're going to go back to a new normal, and continuing to work virtually may be in place in some form for a while. Amy, can I ask you to talk about what you're seeing from an audit committee oversight role as it relates to cyber?
Yeah, I think the biggest question we get from audit committees is are we doing enough? What else should we be focused on? I think there's a focused, heightened awareness, especially as it relates to third-party risk with vendors. So there's only so much you can do to control your own environment, but there's also additional exposure when faced with external parties that you're dealing with, doing business with, transacting with. I know we have secure portals where we share information with our clients to and from, and we have to have safeguards over that. So the control environment becomes really important. And I think the audit committees are really considering what sort of continuing education that they need, whether it's providing it to their own employees or to their vendors as threats continue to rise in sophistication and in frequency. So I guess our audit committees receiving the right level of information from management is another key question that they often ask to make informed decisions about the risk exposure and the overall company's tolerance of that risk. So I really think that, my point about the environment that we're operating in is that, obviously hackers are not at rest. They're very comfortable in their virtual environments. They're just continuing business as usual, finding new ways to expose the risk that the virtual environment is imposing on companies that maybe don't have the platforms or the physical structures to safeguard. I think all of that is something that, as an audit committee, I think you need to be thinking about. You need to be really pulling in your technology folks within your companies to truly understand where those risks may be to mitigate them. So.
Thanks, Amy. Continuing on the thread of working in a virtual environment, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing, how companies are reacting and managing the financial reporting close process, and also how auditors are adapting to doing their work in a virtual environment?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm gonna steal a bit of sentiment from Brian. I think highly positive, I would say, is kind of where I would put us and our clients. I think on the auditor side, the investments that audit firms have made, including BDO, in making technology advances and leveraging kind of the Internet of Things with regard to the use of client portals and other things, have made a more full transition to a virtual online platform fairly seamless. So I think for many of our workers, it's not out of any kind of pain point that they're transitioning to a remote environment. I think the balancing act between juggling, your personal and your professional responsibilities is obviously impactful for everyone. But I think from truly an audit close process, I think the mechanics involved in that and the highly technology transfer of information that's involved in that has not really seen a true disruption. I think on the two-way communication side of the house, whether among audit teams in general or through real-time engagement between the client, leveraging applications like Microsoft Teams with the audit and video connection, I think that's added tremendously to the interaction and the engagement, not only in keeping us connected, but enabling to see body language. I think that becomes important, especially as auditors, when you're going through a process with your clients. You really want to understand, their reception of the information that you're sharing and vice versa. So I think that's been really important. And I think it's been very well adapted by everyone. We've had a lot of engagement with audit committees throughout this process, and I think it's been a really good testament to that. I think the cadence of interaction has also increased significantly between management and audit teams, as well as with the audit committee. And I think that's similar between the audit committee and management, which I'll let Brian speak to in a moment. But I think the engagement between the audit partners and the audit committee chair has been really important as well. And in addition to kind of the routine or schedule meetings that you would expect to occur, I think there's been a lot more of like personal kind of touch points throughout this process, just to make sure everybody's aware and knowledgeable about, risks and reporting responsibilities, as they develop in real time. And then I think finally, from an audit quality perspective, I think you want to be sure that there's an added independence check. And I think internally for our clients, I'll just give an example, because of all the guidance that was coming out from the regulatory bodies, because of all the guidance that was coming out from a reporting standpoint, whether it be from the SEC or from the FASB, I think there was so much happening in such a short period of time that it was really helpful for us to take a step back and say, as a national office, we'd like an additional layer of oversight into the financial reporting process. We'd like to make sure that our engagement teams are truly considering all of the things that are happening so quickly and being able to provide that back to clients as an added check on what their financial reporting looks like. So I think that was really helpful. I think the teams embraced that. I think the real-time oversight and impact and the assistance from our national office helped in that regard. And I think just in terms of the adaptability of companies and having kind of a global audit methodology where it's kind of a systemic thing that serves global companies, I think is really helpful as well. I think what we really have not seen is really any material changes in internal controls over financial reporting that resulted from this, which might be surprising, but I think through a more heightened sensitivity to ensure things like proper segregation of duties. As you shift to a virtual environment, I think companies needed to recognize they might have to change some of their procedures. So I think just being aware of things like that, and of course, management review controls would be another area that, we'll probably have some more vigilance around. And, obviously there've been adjustments to things like cycle counting and inventory observations that people dealt with kind of on, as they arose. But I think overall, I think it was a fairly smooth close process. And I think, again, enabled by technology, enabled by clear and good communication. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for that. Brian, what are you seeing for the boards, for the companies on where you sit on the board?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with Amy. Just a real big payoff on the investments made in technology on both sides, companies and auditors. I was pleasantly surprised as to how quickly both management and the auditors reacted to working in a virtual environment. And in fact, in a lot of ways, I feel like we actually started to work much more closely together, and teamwork got better. Communications much more frequent and much more action oriented. And I think that even though most companies lay out issues that they're going to face in a particular quarter, I think this time around that was done earlier. It was done more comprehensively because in many cases you're also dealing with significant issues arising as a result of reacting to the crisis in terms of either facility closures and temporary idling of facilities, impairments. Some companies would have going concern type liquidity challenges, et cetera. So I think in a really complex environment, I felt like everyone was singing off the same hymnal and really working together to achieve a good smooth close. I had both. Well, three of my companies are calendar year ends, and so we dealt with the first quarter close. But one is March 31 year end, and actually we did the year end, all the year end audit activity virtually, and it went, fantastically smoothly and efficiently. Clearly, our audit committee met more frequently, both with management and with the auditors, and spent a fair amount of time as soon as guidance started to emerge as it relates to the disclosure obligations and desire for as good communication as we could reflect in our public filings as it relates to our views of the outlook for the business and the impact on the current environment to our strategic objectives and kind of near and longer term financial outlook. So I think the benefit of the technology, a willingness to communicate often, and laying out very good milestones to ensure that you're on track as you proceeded through the process, really resulted in my case, in all four companies having really tight and good close processes without any compromise in audit quality or the reporting the results to their investors and analysts. So, all in all, I think a lot of good learnings, and most companies are now studying what can they learn from this going forward, because clearly we all saw opportunities to work differently and more efficiently, and so I think it does have implications for the size of corporate headquarters, et cetera, and the workflow associated with many of these processes. So I think there'll be I think a longer term impact and benefit to what we've gone through if I were to think more positively about the benefits of going through this crisis. And it's not over yet for sure, but I think we've now put the right infrastructure and processes in place to ensure that subsequent quarterly reporting and year-end reporting can happen seamlessly. In all of my companies with calendar year ends, we've asked the question, if we had to do the year-end close virtually, are we really prepared for that? And so, and the response from all firms has been, absolutely, with a strong emphasis on better planning, leveraging the technologies and communicating effectively. That's clearly possible. And, any issues that need to be worked out with good planning, I'm sure can be overcome and satisfactorily resolved.
Thanks, Brian. I think it's a good reminder. We don't know what's in front of us, but I think we all know it's not over right now, and there may be continuing to work in some form of virtual environment for a while longer. So those are great reminders. We've talked about the financial close process for companies and how auditors are managing their work. Amy, our last topic is just about the audit committee communication and engagement in the virtual environment. You know, audit committee meetings tend to be typically an in-person format, but we've all, I think, adapted to different new technology. Can you talk a little bit about their oversight responsibility and whether being in a virtual environment has how it's impacted audit committees?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, I feel like technology has been somewhat of an enabler, and I guess maybe the use of video is a good example, and I think one that I think more people are finding it more enjoyable. I mean, I don't know how you guys are operating, but I feel like we're on camera 24/7 with each other, which is kind of nice. And I'm used to being in front of large groups, but it's nice to see that kind of that camaraderie back and forth instead of just being on the phone constantly. It's nice to actually see who you're talking to and engaging. And I think people have become very effective in meetings at using the raise your hand and the chat feature so that you're not talking over one another, and every point is made and you're allowed to listen and digest and respond to that. I think that speaks actually to audit quality, to be quite honest with you. I think besides the technology aspects, though, I think people are really interested in receiving more information and education. We get a lot of questions, and the engagement with the audit committees is truly around what else can you tell me about this? I mean, this all kind of started to transpire in the height of shareholder meeting season. So there was a lot of questions about virtual meetings and how should I be conducting those, and what are the topics that are going to come up. I think others looking at some of the, truly auditing focus with the new CAM standard for our non-accelerated filers. What does that mean? What does that look like? What are those conversations, particularly around heightened risks that are happening, around goodwill, around impairment? What is that? These are all areas that are probably taking a higher priority in that assessment by the auditor. So the audit committee truly wanted to understand what that means and what that will look like for this period of time. And then I think boards and audit committees potentially meeting more frequently, as I believe I mentioned previously, and really important to keep current on governmental action. So of all the guidance that's coming out with respect to relief efforts and transparency and reporting and all of that really needs to be well understood, plus industry knowledge that's being gleaned daily. I think the other question, that just as committee understanding is really, where is the risk lying? So is it sitting with the audit committee, or is it sitting with a newer committee of the board in some cases? And how is that risk being devised among the different members of the board? So just those are some of the better practices I've seen emerging in the areas of focus. But I do think, harping back to my prior point, I think the communication has really been extremely increased and enhanced, and I think just out of necessity. And I think the stress testing, if you will, I don't know if Brian, if you use those words, but when I heard you speaking about that, it really sounds like for many companies, and I think us as an auditing firm, the stress testing of all of the technology and the capabilities we've built, the frameworks that we're operating under. I mean, this is something that, I hate the word unprecedented, but you've literally had things flying at you from all angles for the past several months. And it was continual. It was a continual force driving the way you're responding, how you're set up to react and engage. And I think, this stress testing, if you will, I think has really prepared companies going forward. And, Brian said, this is not ending. It's still continuing for the foreseeable future. What will that impact look like over the next several quarters? I think from a process and approach standpoint, I think what we just experienced over these past few months has set companies up for some level of confidence in how they can take it forward. So I'll end there. How's that?
Thanks, Amy. Brian, let me give you the last word. Anything that you'd like to add in terms of how your audit committees have been functioning in a virtual environment?
Very similar to the points made earlier. More frequent communication. Getting a handle on new risks that have made themselves evident as a result of the crisis, and getting really precise and crisp definition of, what's the risk and what are we doing to manage and mitigate it, and does it have any financial reporting implications or beyond disclosure, but the need to actually book reserves, etc. I think also the thing that we have tried to do as both a committee and a board is not lose sight of the longer term strategic objectives, and to ensure that we keep our eye focused on customers, making every effort to solidify our brand and gain organic market share. In times like this, M&A in certain circumstances may make a lot of sense for stronger companies. And so, staying true to those longer term objectives and making sure that North Star remains intact is very important for the CEO and the leadership of the company to keep their team members really focused on life beyond this crisis, because it will end, and we all have the objective of emerging from it better and stronger companies as a result of the the pain that we're going through. But there's also a lot of learning in that process that needs to be cataloged, well understood, and then more broadly deployed, on a sustainable basis going forward. So, in terms of interactions with the auditors, similar. It's a lot easier to just jump on a video call to tackle a particular issue instead of having to, either fly to meetings or because we all aren't flying and running around, it's a lot easier to get quick meetings scheduled because we're all working from home, and that has made things, I think, move much more crisply and with a fairly good and quick resolution of issues in what's clearly a very challenging environment. But so far, so good.
And on that note, I want to thank you both, Brian Anderson, a member of the CAQ's governing board, and BDO's Amy Rojik. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights today. And this concludes this episode of the CAQ's Profession in Focus.